Greetings all, and welcome to the first episode in my Eduard Fw 190 A-5 build. In this first part, I'll be painting up the cockpit and assembling the model, and we'll see if Eduard really have one of the best 190s in 1/72nd scale. I start out, as always, by washing the sprues in some warm soapy water to clean any oil and residue from the moulds, and once dry, I begin to cut out the cockpit floor, sidewall details, various cockpit panels, the seat, joystick, and the front bulkhead. I used a knife to carefully remove any excess sprue from the parts, before then gluing the seat and joystick to the cockpit floor, followed by a centerpiece that goes on the floor, and two panels which attach to the rear bulkhead either side of the seat. While the glue bonded, I cut out the instrument panels, exhaust parts, and the various parts that make up the engine. I then used a file to sand away any imperfections, and fitted a spare polycap into the gearbox for the propeller before gluing that onto the engine detail. The fuselage halves, lower wing, two upper wing halves, wing spar, middle exhaust pipe, and the landing gear parts were then cut out next, and once cleaned up I glued the wing spar to both of the upper wing halves and added the middle landing gear bay cover. I test fitted this with the lower wing to make sure the parts lined up, before then adding a small brace which goes in the middle, which I believe also contains some internal piping. Much like the Airfix kit, the cannons have to be installed before the wing top and bottom halves are joined, which puts them at risk of damage during the build, although these parts did fit well and were pretty solid. The rather fiddly centre exhaust pieces were then added to the lower wing, and what I believe is part of the machine gun system was attached to the upper wing assembly, and once the exhaust has been added to the fuselage halves and the front cockpit bulkhead was glued to the right fuselage, it was time to prime the interior. I mixed up some Vallejo acrylic gloss black primer and sprayed it on the two fuselage halves, the wing assemblies, cockpit assembly, the engine, and the instrument panels. I then gave the primer 12 hours to cure before then spraying a light pass of Vallejo Model Air Insignia White, which was used to highlight the raised areas and details of these parts, before then adding their main colours. The inside of the landing gear bay was painted in a few light passes of Vallejo Model Air RLM2 Grey, and the entire cockpit assembly, fuselage sidewalls, and instrument panels were painted with Vallejo Model Air RLM66 Dark Grey. The engine was painted with Vallejo Model Air Aluminium, and once all the colours had dried, I switched back to a brush for some of the finer details. Vallejo Model Colour Flat Yellow was used for the base of the throttle controls, Vallejo Model Colour Vermilion Red was then dry brushed on some of the raised cockpit details, and Vallejo Model Colour Flat Black was used for the details on the control column, some more of the raised side panel details, parts of the cannon barrels and wiring, and the gearbox of the engine. I painted the inside parts of the lower wing and engine cowling area, which might be just barely visible, with some Model Air RLM2 using a brush. Model Colour Flat White was also used for some extra cockpit raised details, and then I painted the barrels of the cannons with Vallejo Model Air Gunmetal Metallic. With the internal painting now done, I used a fine brush to dry brush some Tamiya XF16 flat aluminium along all the raised details, and especially around the wheel well and on the seat to create some metal chipping. To then make the metal chipping more subtle, I waited for the aluminium to dry, before then dry brushing a tiny bit of RLM66 on some of the larger chips around the cockpit, making them a bit smaller, and giving the paint a distressed look around the edges. This process was then repeated in the wheel well using some RLM2, and I also did another coat with it inside the engine cowling. After the RLM2 was dry, I then glued the upper and lower wing assemblies together using Revell Contactor Professional and some bulldog clips to hold them while the parts bonded. To highlight the details on all of these parts, as well as to add a tiny bit of a dirty and grimy effect, I then applied some Tamiya Black Panel Accent. I accidentally didn't record the full process, but this enamel wash flows into all of the recesses, making them darker, and since the paints I used are acrylic, I can then use some X20 enamel thinners to remove the excess panel liner, making the effect less dark and helping it to flow just into the gaps. Once the thinners and wash had dried, I then cut out the decals for the instrument panel and seat belts, soaked them in some water for a little under a minute, and then I slid them into place using a brush, and gently pushed them into position using tweezers and a cocktail stick. Once in place, I then dabbed some Tamiya decal adhesive onto the decals to help them stick to the surface they're applied to. This kit features the option to use an instrument panel with raised details, which you can attempt to paint, but I decided to try the decals on the flat one instead. The clear film on the decals edges though is a little bit too large, so they're not exactly the best. Once the decals had sat for about 12 hours, I had to use my side cutters to remove the excess clear film from the edges of these parts, and once I'd done that, the lower instrument panel was glued to the cockpit tub assembly, and this was then glued to the left fuselage half. These parts fitted well, so I moved on to adding the top instrument panel, followed by the right fuselage. Once again, the fit of these parts was pretty good, and once I joined the parts together, I used some bulldog clips and some Tamiya masking tape to hold the parts together nice and tight. Before the fuselage halves bonded, I also glued the engine to the cowlings. While the fuselage halves bonded, I cut out the glare shield and cowling parts for the A-5 variant. The top part with the machine guns requires a fair bit of cleanup to remove the excess sprue and flash, and the front of the engine cowl also has a piece of plastic bar that needs to be removed from the middle. Finally, the front part of the top cowling was cut out and cleaned up, before I then removed the masking tape from the fuselage and glued the glare shield and cowling parts to the fuselage. The glare shield seemed to be too narrow to fit the cockpit sidewalls, but the cowling parts all fitted very nicely to the fuselage. By now the wing and fuselage halves were pretty much fully bonded, so I sanded any excess flash on the lower wing joints, and then glued them to the fuselage. The fit was a bit awkward, especially around the wing roots, and a fair bit of pressure and some extra glue was also required to get the front of the wing assembly to join to the cowling, but on the whole the fit was still pretty good. All of the controls except for the elevator come as separate parts, which I cut out at this stage, cleaned up, and then glued in neutral positions. The horizontal stabilizer parts were also joined once the rudder was in place. With the controls added, I'd assembled the model as far as I planned to before painting it, so I started to clean up the model using sandpaper to remove any remaining seam lines. Any panel lines that were weak or sanded over were rescored with a knife. The Eduard 190 has a lot of really lovely recessed details, including a lot of rivets, so I was really reluctant to use any putty and risk losing them. The kit did have a few very small gaps, especially around the wings and fuselage joints, but I decided to compromise and see how the model turned out without using any filler on them. As a result, once the sanding was completed, I cleaned off the model and then covered the cockpit, engine and wheel wells with some white tack to mask them off, and sprayed the entire model in several passes with some Vallejo acrylic gloss black primer until the model had a uniform gloss black finish. And with that, the Eduard Fw 190 A5 was largely assembled and ready for painting, which I'll be covering in part 2. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel. And if you have any questions or friendly advice, please leave it down in the comments below. A massive thank you to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund not only buying these kits, but also the products I use to make them and the time I put into these videos. If you want to help support the channel that extra mile and get some nice little perks, then I'll leave a link to my Patreon in the description. All going well, next week I'll have the video covering painting of the model, in which I'll be doing the base camouflage for the aircraft featured on the box art, and then in part 3, which will be coming out hopefully the week after, I'll be adding on those smaller details, putting on the temporary winter wash camouflage, and doing a bit of weathering. Thanks once again for watching, and until the next video, as always, take care and model on.